This is Dr. Charles Parker, and you're listening to Core Brain Journal. It's a place where I connect both fresh discoveries and interesting different perspectives from advanced mind science with the realities of real people and everyday life down on Main Street. Well, welcome aboard, folks. Dr. Charles Parker here one more time, hosting the Core Brain Journal. And we're so pleased to have a guest on tonight who's going to talk about a lot of really topical issues, including emotions, and more importantly, the superhuman mind, if you can get a load of that. And this is Core Brain Journal talking to you about the superhuman mind. And our guest tonight is Britt Brogaard. Dr. Britt Brogaard. Sorry about that, Britt. Welcome aboard. We're so happy to have you on board.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
So what I'm going to do is introduce her in just a minute. We're going to just say a couple words from our sponsors, and then we'll get on because we want to hear. She's very interesting. I tell you that right now. So Core Brain Journal is sponsored by some very interesting folks. One is DHA Laboratories with over 3 million studies. They are deep leaders of experience with the big picture of really biomedical measurements, biomedically measuring, for example, methylation, cryptopyrrole, and copper challenges, all of which dramatically change brain function. Up there outside of Chicago, they have a global service with a molecular focus. Stay tuned and head over to dhalab.com/core for more specific info. CBJ is also sponsored by the nonprofit Barry Robinson Center teams in Norfolk, Virginia, who provide residential care on an evolved family, interpersonal, and they are globally focused as well. They are very TRICARE friendly and see people from really all over the states and often the world. So we're going to be talking more about them in just a second. It's important to know that they have a new voice, a comprehensive assessment voice that includes biomedical testing for treatment failure at this residential treatment center. Quite interesting. More about Barry Robinson Center if you visit over at Barry Robinson, B-A-R-R-Y, Robinson.org/core. Now, let me introduce Britt to you. She's very interesting. She's permitting me as a doctorate level person to be a little bit more familiar, and she's visiting us from Florida. But the nice thing about Britt is she's an international personality. She is originally from Copenhagen, Denmark, and she's going to tell us more about that when we get into it. By way of introduction, I'd just like to say she has co-authored The Superhuman Mind, which is about how ordinary individuals can change their minds and brains. Sounds familiar here at Core Brain Journal. And she's continued looking at how we can bring about positive changes, not just in the area of extraordinary abilities, but also to the mood, the personality, and the true meaning of life for that individual person, what they're going to contribute on their tour here in this life. So with that, let's talk about the superhuman mind. Britt, how did you get in to writing a book like that? It sounds so deep, but so interesting. Just a great title.
Well, it goes back to my childhood, where I noticed that when I was afraid of monsters under the bed or whatever I was afraid of as a child, I had these colorful images, the same kinds of images in front of my mind. I was clear that they were not real, but they were sort of projected. I was too young I wouldn't have known the word hallucination, but had I known that, I probably would have thought that was what it was. But it just came on when I was really afraid. Then fast forward to high school, and one time we didn't have psychology as such in high school, but we had a biology class that covered some psychological topics. And suddenly they introduced a term called synesthesia. And
I love that term. Pardon me for interrupting. I'm
yeah.
absolutely totally nuts about that term. Go ahead and say it. Go ahead.
Synesthesia, yes, it sounds a little bit like anesthesia, and it's not. Of course, the word is related to that, but it's quite a different condition. With anesthesia, you are not conscious of anything. In synesthesia, you have a kind of crossing of senses or unusual images in response to stimuli that other people don't have. So my form is actually not the most common one, but I realized that that's what I had. I had a kind of what's called emotion image or emotion color shape synesthesia, which meant that in my case, it was just in response to fear that this particular image sort of became projected out in front of my mind, and it still does that until today.
Let me stop you right there. Just say a little bit more about that, because I think it's very interesting. It's a neurologic term. The reason I jumped and got so excited about it is, what happens, I guess, is that you can tickle somebody's toe, for example, and have a completely disparate, odd presentation in another part of your body because of the synergy that's why they call it synesthesia. So they're actually connected in ways that you couldn't predict, because you'll have some kind of a response that you wouldn't predict because it's based on that neurologic connection.
Yes.
And I'm going to interrupt and just tell you a word, since you like synesthesia and I got so excited about the word. There's another word that you want to know, which is the opposite of synesthetic, and that's diacritic. And diacritic is when a person is so busy polarizing and suffering with dogma and looking categorically. Synesthesia is the underlying connections that are present that may not be fully recognized at first in the conscious mind. Sorry, I just wanted to mention that.
No, that's great. Yes, so a little anecdote about my own synesthesia. So I eventually found out that that's what it was.
Interesting.
And then we fast forward again to after my PhD, after my neuroscience degree and my philosophy degree, and I did a postdoc in Australia, and I was hiking in a rainforest, and there are some very dangerous snakes in Australia. But since I had been there for a couple of years already, I was used to them. I was able to spot them, and usually they were, if they bit you, of course they were not harmless, but usually they were pretty much just lying in the sun and relaxing, right? But so I was hiking in the rainforest, and suddenly this imagery that sort of projected out in front of my mind comes on without me feeling any fear for the first time ever. And I think that's odd. This is not supposed to happen. It's supposed to only happen if I'm afraid, but I'm not afraid because I was accustomed to the snakes and so on. And then I realized that there was actually a snake quite close to me. So there's a fast pathway for processing emotions that apparently picked up on the snake quite close to me and generated the fear synesthesia. So
that is interesting, isn't it?
Yes, it's just very interesting.
So your preconscious was hooking up with a snake?
Yes, but I was only unconscious of the fear synesthesia. So I like to say that my fear synesthesia saved my life, even if it might not have been quite true.
Well, that is very, very interesting. That's the first time I've ever heard of something like that. Now, you may not be a snake expert, but I'm interested in snakes a little bit. Do you remember the name of the snake?
No, but I know that the two poisonous snakes are sort of colloquially in Australia called the brown snake and the black snakes, and those are the black snakes in the rainforest.
Oh, is that right?
They have a lot fancier name, of course, if you're a snake expert. Yes.
So what did you do then? Now you're there on the path, and you're out there in the woods. Are you by yourself, or are you with somebody?
I was actually with my parents and my brother and his wife. So I was usually the one who had to point out the snakes for them. This time I was not the first one to notice the snake. I was the first one to notice the fear synesthesia. And my sister-in-law said, like, "Oh my God, there's a snake right next to you." But I mean, it was if it doesn't feel threatened, it's not gonna bite you, right? But had I taken a wrong step and stepped on it, it might have bitten me. And then it takes only about 30 minutes before they will kill you. So.
Venomous.
Yeah, so.
Okay, now that's very interesting. So you had some very significant synesthetic experiences.
Yes. So,
from your childhood through high school, even after.
Yes, even now, it takes quite a lot. It takes probably a lot more now than when I was a child, before I get really intense. You can think of it as imagery, but almost like projected outside of your mind, sort of like if you're staring into light for a really long time, and then you have these like little bubbles after images after you're staring into the bright light. So mine is feels that way in the sense that it feels like it's outside of my eyes, but it's much more colored. It's has a greenish bluish color. It has some rotation in it, and it has sort of a peaky kind of landscapey feel to it. So it's the very same one every time, and yeah, it doesn't fail. It has this almost like, after I got to the US, I would always say it's like kind of money colored, but that's not the color of money. It's not where it came.
It's just because you came to the US. That's what it was.
Yeah, they was predicting that probably.
So then, now, what did you learn about that? First, I was going to ask you about the images. Thanks for describing them. So then you have a built-in alarm mechanism in your body that, on the one hand, deals with reality and also deals with the imagination.
Yes, because so in that particular instance, I did not have any awareness of what created the imagery, but in most cases I do. But it can still, it's still an alarm mechanism. I mean, I have had occasions where a person has given me that fear image, and it doesn't mean that there had to be anything wrong with the person, but more like, if you have a bad feeling about a person or something, you think, oh, there's something wrong with them, and so that has happened. So I can't say that it would always be reliable, because it's a reflection of what I fear, right? So
I see. Yes.
So you can't say like, oh, I can be used in a court to detect, the text serial killers or something. That wouldn't quite work. But I mean, it'd be nice, but it's not the case. But that's what I learned. One thing I learned was, I started to think about, okay, if we have this cross wiring, what are some of the reasons that some of us have it? And because it's not that many people, but it's about 7% of the population have a form of synesthesia. That can be, for example, they hear tones or music in colors, or, as you said, like they you touch them in one part of the body, and they might taste it in their mouth, or something like that. So it's a cross wiring of senses that we at least don't have as adults normally. And so I was thinking, like, how would that sort of be carried on in terms of evolution? I mean, it would have to have a benefit, an advantage, and so I started looking into that, and in the meantime, there's been a lot of research showing that in many cases it does have an advantage, but the advantage that it has relate to the particular synesthesia in question, right? So if some people have numbers that are shapes and colors, for example, they might have an advantage in mathematics and so on. So it's not sort of just a general advantage. It's really an advantage that pertains to the particular synesthesia in question. So that's how I actually got into it. But only later did I start a laboratory that studies synesthesia.
Oh, you did? You started a laboratory that did?
Yes.
That's interesting.
Yes. After my
So you found some other people that had this capability.
Yeah, I found a lot. I was in St. Louis, Missouri at the time. And I had, I found a lot of people in that general region. It's obviously easier to study people who were close by, so cheaper and easier than to have to fly people in. One day, a person contacted me in that lab, and his name, he's a public figure, was Jason Padgett, and he had been referred to my lab, and I said, "Oh, I think I have synesthesia, and maybe you can use me." But he wasn't anywhere close. He was in Seattle, or close to Seattle, so on the other coast, or I wasn't on the coast at the time, but sort of far away. And we started talking on the phone, and I was asking all these questions. And then I found out that the most interesting thing about him was not just his synesthesia. He did have a form of synesthesia, but was that he had acquired it after a brain injury, and had also acquired very particular special mathematical abilities at the same time.
Oh, is that right? Interesting.
And now we're almost over where you started with the Superhuman Mind. So one thing led to another, and we started studying people who had these special abilities, and to see what we could learn about ordinary minds from these people.
So where was your lab in St. Louis? I've also been to St. Louis, spent a good deal of my life. Washington University.
That is actually where we conducted the research. I was located at University of Missouri, St. Louis.
Oh, yes, okay.
Everything is very close. There are 3 universities. There's also St. Louis University. But yeah, we didn't have the we had a collaboration agreement with WashU, where we were able to use some of their machines and scanners and so on.
So then what did you do in this study? How did you said scanners, were you looking at brain imaging? Were you doing single photon emission computed tomography?
We've done different things with that first person who had both, so what we call it is savant syndrome.
Yes.
Yes, particularly acquired savant syndrome. So he has acquired synesthesia and acquired savant syndrome. And in this case, we used MRI, but a functional version of that, so functional MRI. And what we were looking at, we were trying to locate some areas in his brain that were generating his synesthesia, because he said that his synesthesia was part of what gave him his math abilities. So that's what we did. And another thing we did was we used something that's called TMS, transmagnetic.
Yep. TMS. We have an interview on that. I think it's about 04, 05. And the other thing I'm interested in is, did you have a specific part of the brain that, because if it would be visual, I would expect it to be in the posterior cerebral area near the cerebrum?
You know what? That's what we thought too. And we surprisingly, it wasn't. It was very much in the parietal. In the parietal lobe on top of the head. In some of the areas, of course, close to the back of the head where the visual area is. We actually found out that another person who has Savant syndrome and synesthesia, who's also a public figure, Daniel Tammet from Britain, who was also well known for Born on a Blue Day, that some other people had done some similar studies with him, and they also found that it wasn't a kind of synesthesia that was primarily based in the visual cortex. It was more sort of a higher order kind of synesthesia. So it's in
what kind you said? I didn't quite understand what you said.
A higher order. That's what they called it for Daniel Tammet's higher order form of synesthesia.
Oh, higher order. I misunderstood you. Yes.
Yeah, or a higher form. It's not. It doesn't mean that it's less visual, because when you look at people engaging in novel imagery that is very vivid, you can also sometimes find cases where you don't have so much activity in the visual parts of the brain and the back of the head, but you have more in the parietal lobe, actually, which is on top of the head. So it's not unusual that you can actually have imagery that's not necessarily primarily based in the visual cortex.
I got you. Yeah, interesting. So then that led you down the path. Somewhere in there with all that research, you said, I got to put this whole package together. I mean, were you in your PhD studies at that point?
No, so I was just when I started doing that, I was after my postdoc. So it was after my studies were done, and after I did the postdoc, and after I had gone, returned to the U.S., or after I was in Australia for the postdoc, right? And I got back and I thought, well, let's see if there are some synesthetes around, and that was when he contacted me, and we because he was far away, we had to sort of coordinate. So I coordinated with some collaborators, and we collaborated on that study. Also, I had to get it right because it was a new area for me. So I had some very experienced collaborators, and then since then, now we moved on with other subjects and did more of the same.
So it sounds like that. And somewhere in that curiosity, you must have developed this superhuman mind concept. Now, I am curious about it. I won't wear you out with it. It's your book, but I would love to hear what your perception was about minds that have some additional capabilities. I'm assuming that's what superhuman means. Let's talk about what superhuman mind is. That'd be the good place to start.
Well, so what we the people we studied, so these people with these extraordinary abilities, they all of them were completely ordinary people. So Jason Padgett worked in a furniture store as a salesperson.
Mm-hmm.
Another public person that we've studied, Derek Amato, who's a great musician now, he was a salesperson. They had no special abilities except for what they were trained to do in their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And Jason Padgett had even dropped out of college, so he had no mathematics background. Derek Amato had no music background; he wasn't interested in music, and so on. So we were thinking, like, well, if these people they hurt their head, right? So we were looking at people who with brain injuries, traumatic brain injury. They hurt their head in one way or another, and in most cases, of course, most people don't develop anything but disadvantages or disabilities, or if they're lucky, nothing. But in some cases, she just heard it the right way, apparently, and you just sort of maybe you have to be, have a slightly more susceptible mind or something, but then you develop these extraordinary abilities. But that must mean that these abilities, these powers, that they must have been in there all along, right? So how else could they come out from just I mean, you take a hammer and you hammer someone on the head and then they suddenly become smart? I mean, that doesn't make sense. So they must have had the abilities in some form of another, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we thought, well, maybe we all have those. And so the book is very much about that. So we talk also about how you can improve your own minds. We talk a lot about memory techniques and abilities to do calculations faster and so on. But we also talk about technology and the near future, about what can we expect in the near future. What kinds of technologies are there for us more ordinary creatures for developing these superhuman minds? So that's sort of what the book is about.
So then let me ask you a little question about that. So what would be the capacities that a person like myself, but I would consider myself a regular average person in terms of what you're talking about. I haven't had any significant head injuries. Was not knocked unconscious. So I would be average in that regard. What could I do as a person that might help me? Give us a little bit of example, if you don't mind, of how a person could train.
Yeah. So in the book, we talk about how synesthesia actually in various forms can be learned to some extent. It does require some training. Mm-hmm. Synesthesia then does offer an advantage in many cases. So, for instance, we looked at so children, of course, already have an advantage, but few children develop, for instance, perfect pitch, where they can just distinguish and name a tone of music. Mm-hmm. Without a reference frame. So even most musicians don't have it, but we looked at children who were developing a kind of synesthesia by associating these tones with say colors and emotions, and some of them developed something like a perfect pitch, which is a definite advantage in music, even though you don't have to have it to be a great musician. So we look at various ways in which synesthesia can help you develop your creativity, become more original, also help memory. So we look at interesting cases of where we take a little bit from what so-called memory champions. Those are the extreme people who have trained themselves to, some of them have trained themselves, some of them are more or less born with it, trained themselves to do these extreme memory tasks. So Daniel Tammet, who was one of the people I mentioned earlier, has the European record in reciting pi to the highest number of decimal points, and so it's like 22,000 or something decimal points.
Really?
For the number pi, you know, so most people can do like 31415, you know, but he can just go on for that, like for 22,000 times, right?
Oh my gosh.
Without looking at anything except like closing his eyes and sort of looking inside his mind. He has synesthesia naturally, but then we look at, okay, so how can you look? So here's a sort of an example that's sort of a baby example, toy example, if you wish. So let's say that you have to remember a shopping list, and you need milk on it. I mean, you need to buy milk. You need to buy a bottle of red wine, and you need to buy oranges. And so you might put the milk in the kitchen, where that's where you find the milk. But then you might, instead of just putting the milk in the kitchen, and by putting it, I mean in your mind, you could make a big waterfall that's sort of absurd, of milk splashing out. Oh, yeah. So you have the absurdity that goes with a certain kind of emotion or a bodily response, and a location. And then the idea is that you then have a route. So you walk in, say, to your living room, and there you see something, say a bottle of red wine, and it's scattered all over, and it looks like blood. And now you have this almost fear, and it's almost like watching a thriller movie. And then you might walk out on your terrace, and there maybe you have some oranges, and maybe they have little faces, and they're chit-chatting to each other or something. So it's funny. So you try to, so there you have locations associated with an object in a certain path, and you have emotions to also help you recall it. So this is a very simple example because there's only 3 items. But when people practice it it doesn't take long before they can remember 10, 20, 30 items easily that way. So even using their own house. And so that's an example of where you kind of use what's inherent to synesthesia, but also some other techniques that have been used by memory champions, namely the idea of having a landscape where you put things so you can walk through the landscape. That will give you the right order as well, which is not necessary if it's a shopping list, but let's suppose it's the number pi, then you don't want to get the numbers mixed up, right? You don't want to get them in the wrong order.
You have to go down the path.
Yeah, so that's some of the techniques, but we also, of course, talk about what is only at the research stage at this point, and those things are not things that you can go out and try because you would have to be a part of a research study. But there are things that we are and other people are starting to use to sort of find those extraordinary abilities in so-called ordinary minds.
Well, it's interesting because as I'm listening to you, I'm imagining the experience, and what it sounds like you have concluded from the synesthetic experience is that if you use that principle of things that are disconnected in some way, and actually finding a connection with disconnections, that it's easier to actually stay with rather than just trying to find a place to put it in your mind. Because they wind up having a life of their own. In their relative discordance, they then become a different thing.
Yeah, and if you don't aim at becoming like a pi memory champion or something, or some other kind of memory champion, usually you can use little narratives from your own life to do it. So let's say that you want to remember pi. So when I had to sort of see how far I could get. I was bored on a flight back from Scotland, I remember. And so I used my first day as a postdoc in Australia. So I kind of skipped the first because the first like 3, 1, 4, 1, 5 was sort of what everyone knows. But then the first person I met was this old guy, or at least I thought back then he was very old. And so I sort of recalled that he was like he looked like he was 92, and so those
Hmm.
were the next two, right? And so I went through, the hallway, and so so I sat there, and I just thought through my first day, and because the first day, of course, is more significant than say my third day, right? So so I had to make multiple. I found that for each narrative I could do about 200. I was not able to do it in the sense that when I stopped practicing, it would slowly sort of fade away. So I
Hmm.
could probably do, maybe with a little bit of effort, I might be able to do the first 200. But I was able to get up to 2,000, and I kind of got bored with that. So
Well, 2,000 is a big number. I mean, that's
yeah, it's
very,
not
very,
22,000, but yes.
that's fantastic. Well, I'm going to ask you a question in just a second, because I think what you're talking about is very interesting. And what I wanted to ask you to do, which is really about you personally and what you do now for a living and how you use this material. So when we come back, what I'd like to do is have you tell us the applications that you use. Are you a professional that uses this in your life? Do you have classes? Do you teach this in addition to reading your book? Let's find out from Britt some of the other things that she does with this really, really interesting information. So, Britt, we'll be back in just a moment. Well, folks, you know as well as I do that psychiatric treatment failure, especially after multiple medication trials and those very, very brief hospitalizations, may prove insufficient to deal at home with the complexity of troubled children and those adolescents from 6 to 17 years old. Improved care, those next mandatory steps, should include a more comprehensive approach to address those multiple levels of challenges, from family to peers to school, diagnostically from defiance to depression, on every level for families, including military families internationally. The Barry Robinson Center's 32-acre open college-like campus in Norfolk, Virginia, provides safety and security and clean, comfortable living. How do we know? We refer folks over there all the time, strongly endorse what they're doing. So for further information, an informed interview, connect at this page, barryrobinson.org/core. Well, you folks already know that here at Core Brain Journal, we're on a mission to introduce you to resources that make significant contributions to the investigation of those predictable mind science applications. Our colleagues at DHA Lab Group provide a real difference with treatment options for people at every level, from first awareness of mind problems to those frustrating times when even well-informed treatment becomes surprisingly unpredictable. For my entire professional life, from psychoanalysis to brain scans, I've searched for, yes, improved predictability. The good news for all of us, from professionals to patients, remarkably effective research offers useful, cost-effective, organic options far beyond guesswork with psychiatric medications alone. DHA lab tests measure unbalanced biomedical details through easily available testing, now available globally for a variety of molecular answers from, for example, methylation, copper, and cryptopyrrole challenges. Check in for more details at dhalab.com core. That's dhalab.com/core. Thanks, Britt. So we're back. Thank you, listeners, for hanging there with us. This is very interesting because we're taking a really uncommon, that's not, a lot of people don't know about synesthesia. That's why I did get a little excited in the run. And here she's talking about synesthesia, which to me is a very, very interesting connective, neurologically connective experience that some people have. And if you're like a lot of listeners at Core Brain Journal and you're looking for connections about the complexity of the mind that have a broader application, well, we're talking to, the doctor here, Dr. Britt Brogaard, who has a very specific technique of using synesthesia to actually take us to another level. So the question that I was going to ask you about is, and this is a little bit mundane based on the seriousness of the conversation, but what do you do? How do you apply it? Are you in practice using synesthetic techniques? Do you have a superhuman mind camp? How does all that work?
So there was a school teacher an elementary school teacher in St. Louis when I was in St. Louis before I moved to University of Miami. She was very interested in synesthesia, and we were just studying how perhaps you could learn or teach people synesthesia. But she was working with these children in classes, and in the very low level classes, first grade, second grade. If you teach the kids, you teach them everything, right? I mean, you're the math teacher and you're the English teacher, and so on. So she was interested in seeing if that would facilitate some of the learnings, particularly with math, and so by having the kids associate some of in the beginning it would just be associations, begin the numbers with colors. And then it would become more automatic, more natural to them over time. And so we found that at least for that age group, of course, children have a natural advantage, but still, it was much easier, as you said, once you got to, a little bit up, and they had to learn the multiplication tables and so on. It was much, much easier for them once they had those connections, and that was just color number connections, right? So, which in a more formal term is called is a form of grapheme color synesthesia, and they might not have had synesthesia in quite the same sense that people who have it sort of from birth or from early on, but they have had it enough that it helped them. So that was an example of where it definitely helped the children learn various things like simple multiplication facts and other things that some kids in ordinary schools might have trouble with. So that's one respect. And we've also that's more sort of interviewed a lot of visual artists in order to sort of get a sense of, there are some studies of artists, population studies among artists who see how many have synesthesia, and it seems to be an increased number. But we also sort of talk to them and to see how much they actually rely on their synesthesia. So that's not necessarily people who learn synesthesia, but people who have synesthesia and then use it in their visual art and actually go into the visual arts because of that. But there are other ways. I mean, there are other ways sort of, if you have to be original, right? People always use this old metaphor, think outside of the box. And most people kind of know what that means, but they don't know how to do it. So it's not obvious how do you think outside of the box, because I mean, if all your thoughts are inside the box, how do you go outside the box? And sometimes that can help to sort of I mean, it can be in all areas of life. So we worked with, for instance, with some people who were interested in starting to write poetry. They just had an interest in it. They weren't naturally born poets in some sense, or maybe they were, but they didn't know it anyway. So there we used synesthesia, which is also a term in the literature. So in English, right, where it means, for instance, if you describe, fear as not just in the cultural sense, where say, sadness is blue, but you might describe fear as being a kind of piercing fear, or you might take something that is in a completely different sensory modality and associate it with something that is in another sensory modality, but you do it in a more conceptual way. And if you look at poetry, in many cases, that is what a lot of poets are doing. Not all poets, but a lot of poets that they're really good at like connecting these concepts that we don't normally connect, but we naturally have a sense of what exactly that means.
It's so well said. That is such an important point, because if you're really going down through poetry and you're listening to it or reading it, and you're taking yourself in the mind of the poet and you're in the environment, the context that they're in, and then they actually throw a different color or a different metaphor on an experience is relatively commonplace, it helps you appreciate that poetry, because it gives you a different wrinkle and it elevates you in a transcendent way of something that might be commonplace, and helps you connect with the larger order in a timeless way, as opposed to here I am right now, here's this thing, and now I'm in this whole other universe, which is what synesthesia is. And it hadn't occurred to me
Yeah,
Maybe
so,
put that out.
so we have these cultural worn down, worn out metaphors, right? With the blue sadness or the orange jealousy, or whatever culture you come from, it might be a little bit different. But but it's really powerful when people manage then to connect something with another color, right? That's really descriptive of, say, the sadness. Right.
Hmm.
So we've also used it actually to get people to talk about their emotions. So instead of trying to describe, how do you really describe sadness? What does that really mean? And they say, oh, well, sometimes I'm really sad, and so I cry a lot these days. You have them like, what kind of color would you put on? And maybe people might start by saying like, well, blue. Well, but that's not what we want you to do. We want you to like think about it, like what color, what shape does it have? And it gets people like, wait, well, the sadness, it feels kind of, I don't know, rectangular and yellow, and it can really help people describe, at least, or maybe more understand, because sometimes it also can really describe their emotions to other people, because other people sort of, they latch on, they kind of get it.
Hmm.
There's something
Hmm.
very natural about synesthesia, to the point where we believe that most people probably have had it at a time when they don't remember, when they were young enough, and that before the brain started the serious pruning away of extra
Hmm.
connections, right? And also that there still are some connections, in that we still associate, for example, really high pitched tones, or high pitch with something sharp, for
Hmm.
example, and more lower pitch with something round and a little more
Oh, yes.
fuzzy. So we have a natural tendency towards synesthesia, I think, and there certainly are some forms of it that are even more natural than you would think. So there's this thing called flavor, right, which we all take for granted, but if you think about it, it's really composed of smell, and it's composed of taste, which is what
Hmm.
you do in the
Hmm.
tongue, and the smell. But then it has a lot of other sensory modalities into it, because you can actually change the flavor of something by adding a different color to it. If you give people something with two different colors, they might have different flavors. They might get different flavors out of it. So you have something that's really multisensory, and meaning composed of many senses, and that's kind of what synesthesia is.
Very interesting. Now, let us take a moment to make sure we get a chance to connect our listeners with your two websites, because what we were talking about just a very brief period of time before we before we lit up the recording, was that you have two different websites. Each one does something a little different. So could you tell us about that, and point us in the right direction? I've got them, and I'll have them listed in the show notes, but you're welcome to say them and then what you do at them.
Yes, so they are both they're both free, available online, and they're written for the general reader. So one is Psychology Today, same name as the book. So Today, the Superhuman Minds.
Hmm.
And just searching those words will actually probably get you to the site. And on that site, we talk a lot about some of the same topics as in the book, and sort of maybe slightly more sort of brain-oriented topics, usually neuroscience-oriented topics, cognitive psychology-oriented topics.
Hmm.
So that's with my co-author Christian Malo, and then the other one is also Psychology Today. It's called The Mysteries of Love, and yes, there's a lot about love on there, but there are also things that are sort of only vaguely connected to love, or maybe a lot connected, depending on how you look at it. But there's a lot on there about narcissism, about avoidant personality style, or the more dependent attachment style. There's some conditions that are not described really in the psychological literature, but more sort of in the mainstream literature, like Peter Pan syndrome. That's like adults who refuse to grow up.
Hmm. Hmm.
Or in this case, I'm running this. And the latest one is sort of about the office sociopath and the workplace bully. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And yeah, so the difference between them is that the mysteries of love, which is psychology today, is more personality, emotion oriented, whereas the superhuman mind, which is also in psychology today, is more sort of brain neuroscience oriented, in more generally speaking. So,
and it's kind of more cognitively developed. How do you actually get that thinking mind to evolve into a more cognitive apparatus?
Yeah, where if there's some new interesting thing that comes out in science, we might cover that, so it's not that it's more science oriented, it's maybe more science oriented in the sense of neuroscience or even conscious brain science oriented, whereas the other one might be more sort of personality psychology, social psychology, emotion studies oriented.
Both of them have to do with coping in the world. One's a little more cognitive, one's a little more affective.
That's exactly right.
If you get the superhuman mind, you've got yourself organized and you can remember what the groceries were. And if you're doing the mysteries of love site, it's more of it has to do with emotional vulnerability and sensitivity, because that's what the issues would be with bullies or the sociopath at the office, because all of us have lived in circumstances like that, and we are hurt by individuals who behave with us like that in the workplace. So it's more of an affective, emotional overcoming that part of it. And the other one's like training your mind to be sharp. And sounds very interesting. So how do you do that? Do you have blog posts over there, or what actually is the interface in those two?
Yeah, so it's blog posts, and of course sometimes I'm more active over there because it is. I attempt to write in the style that sort of most people can go and read without having had to take a PhD in neuroscience or in psychology, personality psychology, or something like that, right? So if I'm too busy with other kinds of research projects, I might not post as frequently, but I try to update it, now and then. And that there's lots of posts already. So if you have not seen it already, there's lots of stuff there to read.
Well, I am going to guess this next one, and you can tell me I'm right or wrong. I'm going to be vulnerable with you. I think you're a poet.
Yes, that's right.
Do you write poetry?
Yes.
Yeah, you do.
Yes.
That's
I do.
So what happens is, will they find some of your poetry over there?
No, they will not. But I believe I still have a link on. I have a Brogaard, a Google site, actually. I'm not so sophisticated with my professional work here. I actually normally have a lab page, but it's down right now, so I'm not going to refer you to it. That's a little more sophisticated normally, but it's down currently. But the Google site is let's see, it's a Google site. So it's Brogaard B is the last part. Otherwise, it's the same as
I got you.
Yeah,
and that's with two A's, listeners. Brogaard B.
Right, and at the sort of in very very small print, underneath the two pictures of me teaching and writing something down and some notes.
No, that's cool. So that's probably Google Plus. It's probably a Google Plus site, like a. Is it Google Plus? Is that what the site is?
It's just called Google site. I've had it for years and years and years, and I never bothered updating to from when I was in Australia. I mean, I just kept the same site. So
I probably shouldn't have asked you about it. Sounds like it's a little private.
No, it is not at all private. It's completely public.
Okay.
But most of it, I was going to say that most of it are these like very super specialized academic articles. But before you get to those, there are these written with very small print. And if you go to that, you can see both the links to my Psychology Today blog, and you can see a link that's called Poetry, I sometimes put stuff up there that I'm not particularly proud of. So I used to publish poetry.
Yeah.
But now I occasionally, if I have time, put a poem up there. But I don't always have time to sort through, and sometimes what I think is what I like is not what other people like, and so on. So.
Well, you have to see. I'm a poet myself, but I haven't been a poet for a long time. I was a poet, to be timely about it. I was a poet for many years and wrote in school papers in high school and college and so on and so forth. And I think with poetry, to use and to close a little bit on this thought, it's really a synesthetic moment when you're in that place, because it is a different place. It's not the same place you live in or that I live in. It's a place that's different somewhere out there, and you find it. And then when you find it, you have a realization in it. And then it's really fun to communicate that realization, because then you have actually taken yourself out of the everyday, and you really have a comment to others that others can share and connect with you on. So,
yeah, no, that's a really good point. You make me feel like writing a poem now.
Well, I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed talking to you. I mean, a lot of what you said is poetry, period, just by the way you're conducting yourself and the way you're thinking about people.
Oh, it's really great talking to you.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on board, and I think it's just an excellent idea for all of us to look at. It's really a story. This little brief conversation is a story about connections, which is really our favorite theme here, taking disparate ideas and weaving them together in some way that has utilitarian value, even if it's just transcendence in the moment. You know, there's some value in the connections that perhaps we didn't recognize, and we can grow from them. So thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you so much.
Brogaard, we really appreciate it.
Yeah.
So you have a
great person to be on. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. You have a good day. Thanks for listening to Core Brain Journal. We're working every day behind the scenes to bring you reports that connect research benches with those street trenches. Here we share the complexity of mind science because, as you know, details really do matter. One of the most pervasive, misunderstood challenges is how commonplace medications, like those written for ADHD, are used so regularly without clear guidelines. If you think you'd like more specifics, take a minute to download my 2-page PDF packed with video links and references on the absolute essentials of how to start ADHD medications. They're easily available at corebrainjournal.com/start. Thanks for listening. Do connect and stay tuned. Together we can make a difference.